Welcome to the second lecture in Module 4, and in this lecture we'll talk about classes and inheritance. Classes in Ruby are defined using the keyword class, and then you provide the name of the class immediately afterwards. And the convention is to use something called camel case, and in fact I wrote the word camel case using camel case in this sentence. So what is camel case? It just means that the words are smashed together, there's no spaces, and you provide uppercase for every word in the name that you're trying to use, in the class name you're trying to use. So here's an example. A class called myClass. I wrote myClass in camel case using the keyword class. And then there's an instance variable that I've defined called boo. And instance variables, we'll talk more about this shortly. We put that @ symbol in front of them. And then I've defined a method called myMethod. And notice the convention there is different. For method names, the convention is to use this, to use an underscore, to not capitalize everything, and to use underscore between words. I've created another instance variable, foo equal to, and I've done an assignment as well, and then where there's an end statement to end that method, and then an end statement as a whole to end the class. So notice how there's end keyword is also used to designate where things end. There's no curly braces or things like that that you might be used to in other programming languages. The other thing you should note here is that there's no type declarations here. Boo and foo are just variables that I create. I don't have to supply any type information. Now, open up your IRB. If you open up IRB, and that's what I'm showing down below on this slide, if you open up IRB, and I'm just going to use the caret prompt from now on when I show IRB, not all of the other thing that's on the other side of that, like the version of Ruby. If you open that up and type in this class that I just showed you, and then type myc equal myClass.new, that calls a constructor. It actually calls the initialize class method that's a part of object. And again, myClass automatically inherits object. You don't even need to do anything. It's just automatically going to inherit that. So this new method calls initialize. Initialize is provided for you automatically. You don't have to write a constructor. And then in order to call the myMethod method, you just say myc.myMethod, which is the typical way of invoking a member function or a method in object-oriented programming languages. Now notice though, if you try and access the boo variable by saying myc.boo, you're going to get an error. You're not allowed to access those instance variables. So the only way we were able to get at this foo variable was by calling that member function. So we'll talk more about how access is controlled in Ruby shortly. Now, what you're seeing in this on the previous slide was that an instance variable can only be directly accessed or modified through a method. You can't directly do it. So here I'm going to provide what are called getters and setters, or accessor methods, in order to get at that boo variable. And I'm calling the first one, I'm creating a method called boo that simply returns that instance variable. And then I'm creating another method that allows me to assign a value to boo. In other words, the first one is a getter and the second one is a setter. And now that I've defined these things, if you drop back into IRB, enter that code to create the class that I just showed you, and now type myc equal myClass.new, you'll create an object and assign it to the variable MC. And now if I say boo equal 1, it's calling the getter. And if I just type boo, it's calling the setter method. So this is the typical thing that you have to do in a Ruby application for a class, is you've got to provide these getters and setters. Now there's a shorthand way of doing that I'll show you shortly. Now the other thing that you should notice, maybe by looking at your Rails application already, is that there's no return value specified in these methods, or in the methods you see in Rails. Simply the last thing that's executed in a method is the thing that's returned. That's all there is to it. So you don't need to use the return value. In spite of that, there is a return statement that you can use if you really feel the need to do so. So here's an example of a very short and readable method that you end up with. Here I'm defining a min method that takes in two values, and it simply compares. If x is less than y, then x. That would cause the function as a whole to return, and so the value x would return in that case. Otherwise, y would be returned. So no return statements are needed there. The other thing that you may have noticed is that parentheses are completely optional when calling a function. And for this reason, sometimes Ruby function calls actually look like you're issuing a command, and this makes it very nice. In Rails, a lot of times it'll look like you're issuing a command, and in fact, it's a function call. But those parentheses are not needed in the function call. Now, it's very common for the I'm going to start this slide over. Now, you can create class methods as well as instance methods in Ruby. And this is, it's not very often that you have to do this, but there are a number that exist for you already that are defined on the object class. And so here's this my class that we're going to create again. And if you use the keyword self, so here's the def, I'm creating a method. And if I'm using the keyword self as I do here, that's a class method. Now, what are class methods used for? And by the way, I'm showing you how to execute that there if you want to go ahead and execute it. Notice that the left-hand side has to be a class and not an object. All right, so the left-hand side of the dot operator here is my class, and then it's invoking the class method. So it's common, for example, let's take the array class, so capital A or R-A-Y. If you want to look at the methods that exist on that class, you type array.methods, and it'll list all the methods that are available to you in the array class. If you call array.new to create a new array object, that's again a class method. So again, it's not common for you to have to write class methods, but there are a number that are available to you. Now, it's very common in Ruby to use the last character in a method name to indicate the behavior of that method. So for example, if the method ends in a question mark, it indicates that it returns a Boolean value. If it ends with an exclamation point, that indicates that it's changing the state of that object. I'll show you this in just a moment when we look at the array class. You can do a sort on the array, or you can do a sort with an exclamation point. The one with the exclamation point actually changes the array. The one without the exclamation point just returns the result and leaves the array unchanged. So typically, if you have an exclamation point version, you also provide a non-exclamation point version. And again, as you inspect Ruby, you'll see this all over the place. Now, here's the other place that you see the keyword self used. Self is used inside of an object to refer to itself, to refer to the current object. So that's the other place that you'll more commonly see the keyword self used in Ruby. Now, there's only single inheritance in Ruby. And having programmed in object-oriented programming languages for a long time, I can tell you it's very rare that you need multiple inheritance. In fact, I've never needed to use multiple inheritance on any code that I've written. So I think this is one of the reasons where it was decided that you really just were going to support single inheritance. If you really need this ability to mix in a bunch of objects, there's this mix-in capability that gives you essentially multiple inheritance. The other thing that's very interesting about Ruby is that classes are never closed. You can always add more data, more instance variables, or more instance methods to these classes, or class methods for that matter. So this applies to both built-in as well as existing, the classes that you build as well as the classes that are built into the programming language. You can simply open up the class and add more methods to it. Here's an example. The fixNum class is an integer class that's provided as a part of Ruby. There's no previous method associated with that. And if you want to create one, just open up the class by typing class fixNum, and you can do this right at the IRB prompt. Type def previous, and now we're going to define what previous does. I'm going to return self, and here we're using that self keyword that I'm talking about, self minus 1. So the current object that you invoke this on, it's going to take its current value, which is going to be returned when you type self, subtract 1 from it. There's no return statement here, but that's the last thing executed, so that value is returned. Then there's two ends here to end the method and then end the class. So let's go ahead and show you how this works. To have some fun with regular expressions, let's open up an interactive Ruby console and let's create a variable called email, and it's going to be of type regular expression, and let's initialize it to the regular expression for emails that I just showed you. So this will create a variable called email, and now we can see if that matches, let's say, my email address. And we see that it does, starting at location 0 here. If we try that, and let's put an invalid email address in here, and we see that the value nil is returned. And I also want to show you that there's a match function that actually returns a match object that you can use with regular expressions. So in this case, this shows that this matches the address. The entire heilman@unm.edu address is matched, and if I take this off, it'll return a nil value. Within a class definition, you can specify access levels using the keywords public, private, protected. If you're familiar with other object-oriented programming languages, you've probably seen these as well. They're a little different in Ruby, though, different than, say, C++ or Java. With public, there's no access control. Anything can access a public instance variable or method, for that matter. And this is like C++ or Java. It's the protected and, more particularly, the private methods that are quite a bit different. So a protected method can only be invoked by objects of the defining class and its subclasses, while a private method can only be called in the context of the current object, and there can be no object reference on the left-hand side. And this is quite a bit different than C++ or Java. So two objects of the same class, they cannot invoke each other's private methods. This is something you can do in some other programming languages that are object-oriented. So what this means is that the receiver of a private method can only be self. You can only invoke the private method from within a method in your class. So a bit of a distinction between other object-oriented languages here. Now, what we've already seen is by default, every method in a class is public and every instance variable is protected. That's why we couldn't access that boo variable unless we provided accessors, the getter and setter methods, in other words. So there's a shorthand way that I already referred to of providing those getters and setters. And that's a pain in an object-oriented language. For every instance variable you create, you've got to create getters and setters. So for that reason, there's a shorthand way of doing that in Ruby. You just type this, attr_accessor, and then you provide this :boo, which turns out to be something called a symbol that we'll study a little bit later. So if you simply provide this attr_accessor, attribute accessor in other words, and use boo, it'll create the instance variable called boo, and it'll create the getter and setter methods as well. Here's a better example. Let's say I have a class called person, and that person has an attribute of a first name and a last name. If I just use attribute accessor first name, last name, those instance variables are automatically created as well as the getter and setter methods. If you only need a getter, sometimes you want to control access. You only want someone to be able to read an instance variable but not change it. Then you use attribute reader. And if you only want a setter method, attribute writer. The syntax for inheritance in Ruby you've already seen when we talked about active records. Again, it's just this less than sign with the new class that you're creating on the left-hand side of it and the superclass on the right-hand side of it. The initialize method is provided for you automatically, as I've mentioned. It's always private, but you can overload it. When you call array new, for example, here I have this a = array new, that's calling that initialize method. So when you use new, it's calling initialize, and you can overload initialize if you want to, if you need to. You can also create a module that has its own namespace. You just put the keyword module around the class definitions, and then, and we've already seen this, then you invoke that particular class or a method within that class by using the : operator. So the name of the module, : and then the names within that module that you're trying to access, the particular classes or instance variables. And this is how you can put a whole bunch of classes together, create a module, and then include that module in other Ruby applications. And in order to include that module, you use the keyword require. So you would say require, and typically this is placed at the top of a file, a Ruby file. Require, in quotes, in single quotes, the name of the module you'd like to include, and that's all there is to it. Within a class, if you use the keyword include, then you're mixing in a module, all right? So what that does is that takes all of the things that have been defined in that module and it makes it a part of that class. And so this is this notion of a mix-in. So if you do include inside of a class for a bunch of different modules, this is how you can effectively achieve multiple inheritance if you really need it. This completes the second lecture in Module 4.